let's get started. My name is Frank. I am German, and what we Germans do best is a lot of bitching. So this will be a session about me spending around about 3 weeks on-site with a customer and dealing with them for half a year in total. The good will not be covered in this session. It's going to be about the bad and the ugly. So if you don't like curse words, there's the exit. Who am I? I'm a solution architect with SimpliVity. I worked with VMware in the actual cloud support team in GSS over in Cork for half a year. Before that, I did 2.5 years in the actual language support for the German team in VMware as well. Double vExpert, and I'm kind of a certification junkie. There's currently, apart from the VCDXs, no valid certification that I can still book into the system through MyLearn. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about design issues. I'm going to talk about operational issues. We're going to dive into monitoring, or rather the lack thereof. Documentation, not so much the documentation from VMware, even though that could get a revamp as well, but rather customer-side documentation. And why do you need a project plan? So let's start with design issues, right? I have worked with more than one customer in the cloud space, and one common theme is we bought this vRealize automation suite. We actually managed to install it after 3 weeks, if we were lucky, and didn't need to call support. Now what do we do with it? So you actually have the gear sitting there. You have scoped out hardware. Somehow you've got servers in the back end, but you have no clue what you're doing with it. You have no use cases. Yes, you started building your first Windows blueprint in VRA, but what do you do with it? Maybe install a database, maybe use it as an Active Directory. The proper way of doing stuff before you even read the installation book is to think, what service are you going to sell, right? If we think about the NIST definition of what a cloud is, it is a measured service in the end, a self-service portal. So you want your customers in the end, either you want to have some showback or some chargeback. So you actually have customers sitting at the other end, hopefully. Otherwise, you're just wasting time. So what are your customers wanting? What do you want to provide to your customers? VRA is a complete beast. It can do XaaS, anything as a service. If it has an API, even if it doesn't, I can use Orchestrator, run script in guest, and I can use bash, batch files, or whatever I want to basically achieve anything. That needs to be clearly defined before you even start installing the software. Otherwise, you have everything up and running and don't know what to do next. High availability comes into play as well. How much uptime do you actually need? What's your service SLA around not only uptime? Uptime is fairly easy to define, right? How much downtime can I sustain? Let's take manager servers, for example. What do I need to put into place, because that's manual failover, to actually get someone called up or rang up in the night to fail over that service, or how do I automate that? But performance is another thing. Performance SLA, at least I found with speaking to several customers, is a non-issue. Everybody just expects the cloud to perform. Having worked on an internal cloud in basically every company I was employed with, performance always was lacking. So most people only think in high availability in terms of uptime, but reality is, even if you can ping the service, even if the service is responding somehow, if you need to wait 5 minutes for your results, your end user will not consider this as up and running. So their tendency to actually pay you for what you're charging them will drop over time. Scaling and installation and upgrades is also one thing. That project I was involved in had a year worth of work done before. They ran into some issues, starting out with vRealize, or VCAC as it was called back then, 6.0. Ran into some issues. OK, let's scale. Let's make everything highly available, because that will definitely fix the issues. It didn't. Then the next step was, well, there's an update now. Let's install the update. Rolled out 6.1, broke some more stuff on the way. Initial issue was still there. Then 6.2 came around the corner. Well, let's do an update. We'll surely fix the issues. No, it didn't. Before you start even to upgrade your cloud, and upgrade projects are rather a common and long process that you want to plan, don't do it on a whim. Read the actual release notes if your issue is fixed. Back then, VMware actually released a couple of patches in the next update that actually fixed the customer's issue. So support was not engaged. It was just assumed that everything they ran into was fixed. Same as for scaling. You're not going to take a cloud, take a load balancer, and put stuff behind it without testing it first. So before you scale an installation and before you even install a cloud, you want to have a very similar test environment to that cloud. You basically, if you have a VRA installation, you should have a second VRA installation to test those upgrades, to test system extension. Database is also scaling. We worked for almost 3 weeks to actually get a proper failover procedure for the databases. Postgres is interesting in that regard. The documentation at that point in time was, shall I say, lacking in terms of, well, Postgres has write-ahead logs, and there's this one config file telling you to only truncate those when 50 megabytes are free on the root partition, which really is not a good idea. Now the documentation says, add a second disk, have that 20 gigabytes in space, and put the write-ahead logs there, because then your whole environment doesn't stop if your disks are too slow. So high availability is not only high availability in VRA, it is other components as well that interact with VRA. And that interoperability is, let's say, difficult to achieve. VRA has its own support metrics, its own interoperability guide. And then it connects to vSphere. Again, own metrics, own interoper guide. If you think about VRO, orchestrator, VRA basically out of the box doesn't provide too much. Yes, you can do infrastructure as a service in a very basic way. You can do some basic chargeback, showback, but if you want to offer that, you don't really want to offer just spinning up VMs. Something needs to be running in those VMs. So most likely, you want to have some sort of scripted installation with that process. And that is where VRO comes into play. There is several hooks throughout the machine lifecycle where you can interact with VRO from out-of-box functionality. VRO in itself, the normal OVA, is not intended for production use. You need to tweak VRO quite a bit, actually. Part of that is that you should have your own database for VRO because it's logging a lot of stuff in there. It's going to kill your database in a real production system. Yes, it's fine having a shared database for vCenter, VRA, IaaS, and everything VRO on the same system during your POC stage. But this will horribly, horribly fail when you run this in production and want to scale out to tens of thousands of VMs. It's not going to work. It needs its own database. Multi-tenancy, especially for people coming from vCloud Director, is an interesting topic with VRA. VRA doesn't have multi-tenancy. It gets a bit better in the next version. VMware has released bits and pieces on improvements there. But essentially, an admin in vRA can affect other tenants. If you have access to all the storage in an environment and not only to the storage in your tenant's environment, you can screw people over. Noisy neighbor actually can become another issue again. So that needs to be actually planned out. If you look at how VMware itself provides vRealize automation as a service, they have a cloud service for that. It's essentially a vRA environment spun up for each and every customer. So each and every customer gets their own vRA machines, their own IaaS machines, and their own backend, because vRA cannot do proper multi-tenancy. Let's continue with VRO. On the operational side, even if you have split out VRO, first thing you do on a production VRO instance is to increase the heap, because it's Java, and Java is not exactly resource friendly. If you want that thing to perform, you increase the heap. And the RAM for that instance. Again, the OVA is not production ready. The default configuration is not ready for real production, for real cloud. If you have a very complex workflow, and I've worked with customers where workflows were running for 2 to 4 hours just to install stuff, you better have documentation for that workflow. You better have change management for that workflow. One of the actual VMware engineers described it in a way that you build in knocks and hooks so that you can get messages out of the system while you're creating the workflow. Because if you try to do that afterwards, it's not going to look pretty, and you don't really have an idea. If you have to scroll 5 times through your screen before you can get from top to bottom of the workflow, after a month, you don't know anymore what you have written there. Documentation is complete key. Also, monitor your VRO server. We had VRO go crazy on CPU during clone operations, simply because that was a very CPU-intensive task. Because, well, in test dev, it was enough to browse the whole vCenter inventory with my 10 VMs in there. Well, nothing much VRO is doing. Now I have 2,000 VMs in my inventory, and I'm still doing a fetch all to get one single VM instead of using an optimized search algorithm. It's going to kill VRO. So just because it works in test doesn't mean it works in production. And workflows need to be documented and tested properly. From an interoperability point of view, it's basically really, also from an operational point of view, be very, very careful with patching stuff. There's a few bugs now in ESXi that tends to break things like Quiesce snapshots. NSX was broken in some releases. If you're using backup as a service and you're using vSphere 6, you probably don't want change block tracking enabled. So depending on the API you're using for the backup software, if you're using backup as a service, that is something you need to be aware of. And it gets a real pain when you have issue X and it's resolved in release Y, but release Y can't work with VRA yet, or can't work with NSX yet, or Operations Manager, or anything else out there. It is a mess. Licensing was also a fun part. We actually were wondering, well, marketing material says you can deploy to physical machines. You can deploy to the cloud. You can deploy to Hyper-V, or the equivalent of vCenter on Hyper-V, SCCM. And we were missing those options, but we had a perpetual license. Very easy fix. There's 2 types of licensing models. One is per core, per host core. One is actually per VM. Physical deployment, since VMware doesn't know how many cores are in that physical machine, right? How many cores are underneath to license in, let's say, AWS. You actually need a specific license type to deploy out to specific endpoints. That has a pricing implication in the end. You should plan beforehand on that, because otherwise you have a great cloud, but no endpoints to use it. So you have a portal, but you can't deploy. Or you can only deploy to your virtual endpoints to vCenter Server. But if you want to go into a hybrid cloud model and use something like cloud bursting, right? Not possible that way. That needs to be planned beforehand. Error messages is also a very fun part because VRA doesn't have proper error messages. It kind of uses the style of unknown error 5, which is painful. And users tend to screenshot that error message without anything else. Users, especially in a cloud environment, need to be educated that A, timestamp, B, username, C, URL, because you can see the API call in the URL. Very handy feature. If you want to grab Catalina logs, you can directly see that. You can grab the Apache logs on the VRA appliance to see, did the actual call come down to the VRA appliance? Was it handled in Apache? And did it kick off something to either an agent or a DEM or the IaaS web server, right? Very handy to have. But if someone only snapshots some sort of ID and says, I had an error, without providing any steps beforehand, it's not going to work. Even if you use the built-in monitoring features, you'll get, it's not Java stack traces that you get, it's C# stack traces. Choose your poison. They both are ugly, and they both usually don't tell you a root cause. So always get as much context around it. And that essentially is a documentation issue. You don't hand over a cloud environment without any user documentation. Or let's say you shouldn't do that because it will hurt you in the end. There's a huge operational cost in there when you're troubleshooting tiny, tiny issues and you're either working with support or doing that yourself, and you're just going through Java logs and C# logs and IaaS logs to find the actual root cause. VRA in itself, even without vCenter, is such a complex system, it takes normally hours to find the cause of an issue. Even if you know what you're doing, the type of error messages you're getting are not really helping. Starting and shutting down an environment is also a very fun part with VRA. Who in here actually has a VRA environment? Who has successfully shut down that environment and started it up on the first try? RabbitMQ is not fun. Is your VRA environment actually distributed, and is it highly available? So do you have 2 VRA appliances? Did you know what you're doing, or were you lucky? Okay. For the rest of the room, RabbitMQ is called a clustering service that usually shouldn't involve state information. And unfortunately, RabbitMQ does have state information. It needs to be shut down and started up in a very specific order. Otherwise, RabbitMQ just falls flat. The last node you shut down holds all the state information, so that needs to be the first node you bring up again. If you don't do that, every service hooking into VRA, and that is the IaaS service, basically your website, that is messaging, that is the whole 15 services the VRA appliance is handling, they don't get up at all. And you start noticing that after about 10 to 20 minutes, because VRA also kind of needs a long time to start, at least in 6.2. And when you do that wrong twice, you basically have lost an hour. So it actually impacts your uptime SLA at some point. There is documentation for that. Have that handy. Most times when I called into an outage, it wasn't really a software issue. It was someone doing something wrong in panic mode. Oh my God, something is down. Let's reboot everything. Let's try Microsoft troubleshooting procedure, right? A reboot will fix it. And then afterwards, you actually have more issues in VRA. Yeah, documentation is key. Have that reboot and shutdown order handy. Also, manage the service failover, right? In theory, you shouldn't need anything. Actual documentation says restart all the DEMs, restart all the DEM orchestrators, and restart all the agents. If you have 10 vCenters behind your cloud, restarting 10 agents takes a while. You should be aware of that. It should be documented. You should have a runbook on how to properly shut down an environment. Same as in vCloud Director, networking is actually also key, right? In the end, you're working with virtual networks, be that VCNS or NSX, if you want to do it at actual scale. You're not going to abuse ports on your distributed virtual switch. You're going to run out of them. So you need some sort of overlay protocol. That overlay protocol in VRA is VXLAN. VXLAN has the nasty property. It doesn't work with MTU 1500 very well. Those do not fragment bits are actually not very good on the network. It's mandatory that you have configuration management and change management on the physical side as well. If someone just changes some setting without telling you about it, it can have horrible effects, especially that MTU size. We've run into so many unexplainable deployment failures because suddenly it was going through a path where 1500 MTU was on the switch port because someone just replugged the cable without telling anyone. And we spent days on finding that because it's not going to get locked, right? VRA doesn't know about it, and the IaaS machine doesn't know about it. It happens on the ESXi level. And actually mapping the ESXi and the vCenter the agent talks to is a real pain. Has anyone of those who have VRA installed seen the wonderful error message, internal error? I know of at least 6 ways to produce that in 6.2 GA. And they are all browser related. In the end, it's going to a Google framework, and depending on your browser speed and click speed, if you click fast enough, you can actually provoke a couple of those. You want to teach your users patience, and ideally, you want to standardize your browser to a version where you know that's tested in your installation where you get the least internal errors, because internal errors will just flood your help desk. It's getting better and better the more these errors are reported, but try to have your user base use a common browser so that you at least have a common denominator there. Makes stuff so much easier. Because some errors only were on Internet Explorer 8 for some reason, because it didn't follow standards of Google's framework. Monitoring. The first thing that usually runs out in a cloud environment is storage. Even with dedupe, etc., it's either storage performance or it's space. I've seen so many failed deployments just due to space issues. Have something in place to monitor that. It shouldn't go off when it's full. It should go off when it's 70, 60% full even, depending on how busy your cloud is. You also want to have a mechanism to scale your storage in a decent way. I'm obviously biased, but hyperconverged sounds like a very good way. Instead of buying SAN array after SAN array after SAN array. That gets expensive very fast. So think about that before you deploy as well. Same for log management. We had an engineer who really liked Linux tools. He liked tail, he liked grep. So he thought on the IaaS machine, which unfortunately is a Windows box, he would install the Windows GNU version of that. Turns out that locks the log files, and VRA can't rotate those log files then. What happens in the end is, well, at some point you're going to abort that tail, be that system updates or anything else. It's going to kill the CPU, truncating all those 1 kilobyte log files that get created on a minute base when you have 2 million files in a folder. That basically takes your whole installation down because that's your IaaS manager machine, which controls communication to DEMs and to agents, so no deployment anymore because somebody ran a Windows version of tail. Failed services. If you ever see the default page when you go into the VAMI of the VRA appliance, that is of no good for service status. It just shows on-off, right? There's no details. Especially the manager service, the IaaS manager, will, for example, show failed when a DEM orchestrator is not running. Why, I don't know, but there's an API call you can do which will actually tell you the root cause. I'll include that into the speaker notes, that URL, and Alaric will get the slides so that you can use the proper URL for checking services. Also, provisioning. Monitoring that is rather hard. A proper solution probably would include something like LogInsight, where you can do intelligent analysis after having gotten all the logs. When you try to do that the manual way, you're looking into hours. You need to do that in an automated fashion. The actual VRA capabilities in that topic are horrible. It's always fun to come into environments where nothing is documented. Well, do I have an IP range free? Maybe. Let's try it out. What could happen, right? Duplicate IPs? Well, it's a virtual network. Nothing will ever go wrong. And afterwards, he thought out a new job description. Document all changes, have all IP ranges documented, document passwords. You don't want to be the guy that calls support at 3 a.m. in the morning because the cloud is down, and you don't have the root password to log in to actually troubleshoot logs. That is not going to work. And documentation is a pain in the cloud. Michael knows the SDDC framework for VMware documentation for it. How long is it? 20, 30 pages, just Excel sheets, right? Documenting everything. It's a huge overhead. And normally a cloud project is a very, very short project on a timescale basis. We are pushing fast to market, right, in everything that gets deployed today. So the sacrifice is usually documentation, which gets you started very quickly. But in the long run, if you haven't documented it, it's going to bite you. I can promise you that. A cloud project with VRA will involve several support calls. I'm not aware of an actual production environment that VMware sold during my time at VMware where there was not a single support call. So you need that documentation. Even if it's not for your sake, because you know the environment, but if a support engineer goes onto your environment and you need to explain 3 hours what's going on in your environment in the first place, you're not going to have a good day. If you can send that documentation without passwords directly with the ticket, the support engineer, before even picking up the phone, gets at least an overview over it. Change management, I talked about the port, right, is key as well. If you change something, stuff usually breaks. It tends to. Ever tried changing the IP address of vCenter server if you have IPs in the certificates? vCenter server comes up. Everything trying to communicate to vCenter, not so much anymore. Once you've changed SSL certificates, vRA completely breaks on vCenter side because it doesn't know. You need to reload the thumbprint. When you actually forget to change SSL certificates on vRA, vRA completely breaks. So change management, change documentation, reminders on certificates are very, very much recommended. And the last part, why do you actually need a project plan? The installation I was working on was not planned from the start, let's put it that way. And we had issues with deployment, and we knew the system needed to be online within 3 months. So we had no project plan, so the preference was, let's fix the deployment issues first, and then try to move to the next phase without any timing commitments or anything. So what happened was we had a 2% failure rate in deployments 1.5 months in. I recommended, well, you should start testing your functional tests right now with actual users. We'll deal with the 2% failures on the way. No, we need 100% deployment rate. In the end, the whole project basically was missed because, well, after 2.5 months, we fixed all the deployment issues, and now all the rest of the project was cramped down into a single week, basically. So that included user testing, user acceptance testing, performance testing, documentation, user documentation, internal documentation. That doesn't work. You need to have milestones with a set date when you are going to start what, with specific acceptance criteria. And the only way to get that is to have a proper project plan. Not only to have that timeline, but to also document your plan B. What happens if we miss a milestone, right? Because at the end, what's going to happen? You're going to call VMware support, and that poor guy on the other line, on the other end of the line, he's going to have to fix several issues with huge, huge pressure because this needs to be online in a week. That is not a good experience for the support engineer, who you couldn't care less for, but it's also going to affect your environment in the end. Because realistically, it's not possible to fix a lot in a very short amount of time. And that will fall on your back if you're doing that wrong. With that said, one last thing, again, interoperability. If you're using WAN optimization devices between your sites because you're using vRA globally, make sure that certificates presented by these WAN optimization devices are actually what they are supposed to be. There seem to be some settings where you do SSL caching, and vCenter then doesn't display the correct thumbprint, and it completely breaks, and it's locked nowhere. You actually need a packet trace to see that, because if you go to the web page through that same optimization device, it's going to display the correct thumbprint, the correct certificate. On the wire, it's going to display something completely different. Just a hint for worldwide projects. Have rarely seen them work as well. Latency is not a friend of vRA in terms of communication, which can affect deployment times. With that, the slides are basically done. Any questions?
You said about the not trusting the value page for service status. How would you check the service status of containers?
So there is a very specific URL you can go to, which will give you an XML API output with last timestamp this service updated, and if it is in failed state, an actual error message instead of just failed. It will be in the speaker notes of the slide deck, so that you can you just bookmark that and use that. If you're using a load-balanced environment, by the way, the load balancer recommendation for the VRA appliances is basically active-active, right? So don't use a load balancer URL for that API call. Use the specific appliances to see which one is in failed state. Also, I mentioned this to one of the folks on the floor on the SSL session. The manager service, when both are running, it's not good. It's not an active-active service. Keep that in mind. It's kind of like Postgres. It's active-passive. And the implication is basically you spend hours and hours and hours of troubleshooting because two manager services are running. Nothing is being logged why it fails. It will just fail because request A goes to manager service A, comes back, then needs to go out to the agent, goes to the agent communicates back through the load balancer shifts to manager service B, who doesn't have the state information of the request. It's going to time out and fail. And all you're going to see is a timeout. And that's it.
In your slide notes, have you got about how to increase the Java heap size as well?
I don't, but I can add it before I send that off. No problem there. That is actually very well documented on the VMware knowledge base, thankfully. So I include that KB article. And nobody left throughout the bitching. Very good.
Is there anything good about VRA after that?
So I have seen it work, right? And when it does, it is brilliant what you can do with the system. Once you go past the IaaS stage, once you go past that infrastructure as a service stage and go into the anything as a service, it becomes brilliant what you can do with it. It's one of the most extensible and powerful systems out there today.
A lot of the problems, sorry, lost
it's all good.
question.
Yep.
A lot of the problems you have in there, they are trying to fix as a VRA 7, correct?
So a lot of the issues is actually configuration-based in most cases, right? It's lacking documentation. It's trying to do something you shouldn't actually do. It's not so much software bugs. I ran into a couple of software bugs with vRealize. We ran into deployment issues because vCenter Server is providing an XML file for versions so that you are not deploying to a vCenter Server 2.5. And
Frank,
throughout the whole deployment, it catches that.
I'm reluctant to jump in at this point. So where have you flown in from?
Pardon?
Where have you flown in from? Was it Cork or Germany? You've flown in?
Cork?
Fantastic. Our next speaker has come from California, and we've got to get 300 people into the room. So I'm very sorry to cut you off in your prime. Top trumps of international aviation, that one went out. Can everyone give Frank a really big round of applause? Thanks so much, Frank.
Thank you.
It was great. Actually, can I keep it on?